What's going on, guys? I'm CFB Kings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Really appreciate you tuning in today, and I hope you're having a great July so far. The 2024 season is getting closer and closer, and we're starting to get into conference media days and everything, and the College Football 25 video game is coming out shortly here in just a couple days, and everything is starting to feel like it's getting focused in on college football again. So if you like what you hear today, make sure to subscribe to the channel on YouTube and follow CFB Kings on Twitter and Instagram for all things college football as we approach the upcoming season. So for today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at a team that I think could have a massive impact on our sport this fall and who can be right in the middle of the college football playoff and national championship discussions later this season. In 2023, the Clemson Tigers went 9-4 and finished ranked AP number 20. It was the first time since 2011 that they had more than 3 losses and the first time since 2010 that they didn't win at least 10 games. Clemson didn't live up to the standard that the college football world has been accustomed to seeing them play at over the past 15 or so years, but they weren't really as far off from being in the ACC Championship and college football playoff conversations as it might have seemed. Last season, Clemson had some very odd games, and while I was looking back through some of them, watching highlights and gathering information, I realized just how close they were to being right where they had been in previous seasons where they made it to the CFP. And I found some crazy stats where in basically every game that they lost in 2023, it took the occurrence of something that had either never happened in Clemson history or something that hadn't happened in a very, very long time. 2023 was historic for Clemson, just not in the way that they might have hoped. Against Duke, for example, Clemson passed for over 200 yards and rushed for over 200 yards. Prior to that game, when Clemson passed for 200-plus yards and rushed for 200-plus yards in the same game, the Tigers were 108-0 as a program and 58-0 under Dabo Swinney. They had never lost, not just under Dabo, but in their entire history as a football program when hitting those passing and rushing marks in the same game. And this next one, what I'm about to say is one of the strangest stats I've ever seen in a college football game, but in that game against Duke last season, Clemson had more first downs than Duke had points, and Clemson lost the game by 21. Clemson had 29 first downs, Duke had 28 points, and Clemson lost 28-7. For reference, Duke had 17 first downs. Clemson had 12 more first downs and 21 less points. Also in that game, there were 3 different occasions in which Clemson was on Duke's 1-yard line and ended up not scoring a single point. They fumbled twice at the goal line, and one of those fumbles was picked up and taken 60 yards the other way to the opposite 40-yard line, I believe. Clemson made 5 trips to the red zone and scored a total of 7 points. Another odd play in that game that I noticed while watching it back was in the fourth quarter when Clemson was driving, trying to stay in the game. Their quarterback, Cade Klubnik, was targeted by a Duke defender, and the play resulted in Duke getting possession of the ball. The play was on 4th down, and the targeting call was ruled as a dead ball penalty after the play, so Klubnik, the starting quarterback for the Tigers, was targeted, and the play ended with Duke getting the ball. In their 31-24 overtime loss to number 4 Florida State, that was the first time the Seminoles had ever won an overtime game on the road. It was a game that the Tigers controlled for really almost all of regulation, and they led by 10 points on 2 different occasions. In order to force overtime, Florida State needed a 60-yard scoop and score touchdown after a Clemson fumble, and they needed the Tigers to miss a chip shot 29-yard field goal. The kicker that missed that field goal for Clemson, Jonathan Whites, was not on Clemson's roster the week before the game and actually lived in an entirely different part of the state of South Carolina. He was Clemson's backup kicker for a couple seasons, but had retired from football before the 2023 season. And after their starting kicker last year had struggled through the first few weeks, Dabo Swinney called Whites and asked if he'd consider rejoining the team the week of the FSU game. So they were more or less operating without a legitimate starting kicker for the first half of the season, and they had they made a 29-yard field goal, they could have beaten number 4 Florida State 27-24 in regulation. The ESPN win probability indicator gave them an 84.4% chance to win with 3 minutes left in the game. In their double overtime loss on the road to Miami, Clemson, again, similar to that matchup with Duke, failed to score a single point on 2 different drives in which they reached the Miami 1-yard line. And despite Will Shipley fumbling at the goal line on one of those drives, the Tigers still led by 10 points with 8 minutes left in the game before a late rally by Miami to force overtime. Clemson was given an 84.4% chance in the fourth quarter by the ESPN win probability chart to win that game as well. That 28-20 loss in double overtime was the first time Clemson had lost on the road to Miami since 1956. In their 7-point loss on the road to NC State, Clemson's defense limited the Wolfpack to just 202 yards of total offense. The Tigers had won 65 consecutive games when holding opponents to 202 yards or less, and their last such loss came in 1988, ironically also to the Wolfpack. Additionally, Clemson held NC State to just 9 first downs, and prior to that game, the Tigers had been undefeated under Dabo Swinney in games in which it held opponents to single-digit first downs. It was the first loss when holding an opponent to 9 first downs or less since 2007. They outgained NC State by 162 yards of offense, and Clemson had won 44 consecutive games when outgaining opponents by 162 yards or more. The last time that they lost a game in which they had 162 plus yardage differential was in 2016 against Pitt, a season in which Clemson eventually won the national title. And lastly on this subject, there was a point in Week 11 last season where Clemson had the second best offense in the country in terms of trips to the red zone per game at 5.43, but the 120th ranked offense in terms of points per red zone trip at 4.16. And this was in Week 11 too. So for basically the entire regular season, Clemson was getting into the red zone more than almost every single other team, but just totally collapsed every time they got past that 25-yard line for some reason. So to summarize all of that, Clemson had some historically tough breaks last year, and every time they lost a game, it required either something happening for the first time ever or for the first time in at least 35 years. They outgained Duke by 48 yards and had 12 more first downs and lost by 21. They outgained Florida State by 118 yards and had 9 more first downs and lost by 7. They outgained NC State by 162 yards and had 11 more first downs, and somehow lost all of those games due to fumbles and red zone struggles. In their wins last year, they beat their FCS opponent Charleston Southern by 49. They beat FAU by 34. They won at Syracuse by 17. They beat Wake Forest by 5. They beat number 15 Notre Dame by 8. Georgia Tech by 21, number 20 North Carolina by 11, South Carolina on the road by 9, and they capped off their season with a 38-35 victory over Kentucky in the Gator Bowl. Despite having a subpar season, if you go by Clemson standards, they ended the season on a 5-game win streak and will head into the fall with the third longest active win streak of any team behind just Michigan and Arizona. Moving on to 2024, if you're listening on podcast, the Tigers will play Georgia in Atlanta, App State, NC State, Stanford, Florida State on the road, Wake Forest on the road, Virginia, Louisville, Virginia Tech on the road, Pitt on the road, the Citadel, and then finish the regular season at home against rival South Carolina. According to the ESPN FPI, the Tigers have the 26th toughest strength of schedule in 2024, but built into it, they have a couple of notable advantages. This season, Clemson will travel the fewest miles of any team in the ACC. The Tigers will travel a total of 2,471 miles for all of their road games, with an average road trip of about 495 miles. Clemson and Virginia are the only two ACC schools who won't leave the Eastern time zone at any point in the season. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see, but if you're listening on podcast, with the addition of Cal and Stanford and SMU to the ACC, the travel distances are pretty ridiculous for some teams. Clemson will travel 2,471 total miles this fall, while Cal has an average road game travel distance of 4,132 miles. One road trip for Cal is almost 1,700 more miles than Clemson's entire season of traveling. And Cal will travel a total of about 20,660 miles, getting up near 21,000, which is insane. And even Florida State, the Noles will travel 13,028 miles with an average travel distance of 2,605 miles. And theirs is a little skewed because they go to Ireland week 1 to face Georgia Tech, but FSU also travels up to South Bend to face Notre Dame and out to Dallas to face SMU. And Clemson hosts Stanford, but doesn't have to travel to any of the new ACC teams. Some other key things to know about Clemson's schedule are when they play certain opponents and how their bye weeks factor into those games. The Tigers' toughest matchup of the season is in Week 1 in Atlanta, of course, against number 1 Georgia. So they get all that time in fall camp to plan out how they want to approach the Dogs. Then their first bye week is September 14th, which is the week before they host NC State. And like I mentioned before, the Wolfpack beat Clemson last year and are poised to be a challenge again in 2024. Their second bye week is October 26th, right before they host Louisville, who was in the ACC Championship game last year and who returns a lot of production from that roster. One of Clemson's other toughest games will be on the road at Florida State. Clemson hasn't lost in Tallahassee since 2014, and the week before the Tigers go to Tallahassee is when the Noles make that trip out to Dallas, which I believe is Florida State's second longest road trip of the season. And while they're out in Dallas facing an underrated SMU team who won 11 games and their conference title last year in the AAC, Clemson will be at home facing Stanford. Moving on to Clemson's roster, the Tigers are tied for 27th in returning production, with 68% of their production from last season coming back. They returned their starting quarterback in Cade Klubnik, who accounted for 3,026 total yards and 23 total touchdowns last season. This will be his second full season as a starter and the second season in offensive coordinator Garrett Riley's system. Klubnik had 2,844 passing yards last year, and that was with multiple major injuries to the receiving room, which I'll touch on in a minute. They returned their starting running back in Phil Maffa. They lost Will Shipley to the NFL, and many people might think that he was Clemson's main guy last year, but it's a common misconception because most college football fans probably heard his name a lot more, but statistically, Maffa had a lot more yards and 8 more touchdowns than Shipley did last year. He had 965 rushing yards for 13 touchdowns, averaging 5.4 yards per carry last year. His best game was against one of Clemson's toughest opponents. He ran for 186 yards and 2 touchdowns against number 15 Notre Dame. He also had 71 yards and 4 touchdowns in Clemson's bowl victory over Kentucky. Behind Maffa, the Tigers will have Jay Haynes, Jarvis Green, Keith Adams Jr., and 4-star freshman David Eziomume, I believe is how you say it. One of their weaker position groups last season was wide receiver, and that was primarily due to a bunch of injuries, like I mentioned before. From last season's roster, they returned wide receivers 1, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, and 9 in terms of receiving yards. They lost wide receiver 2 in Bo Collins, who transferred to Notre Dame. He had 510 yards and 3 touchdowns, but just 373 of those yards and 2 of those touchdowns came against FBS opponents. They bring back Tyler Brown, starting tight end Jake Brenningstool, Troy Stellato, Adam Randall, Antonio Williams, running back Phil Maffa, and backup tight end Josh Sapp. Their top projected receiving threat heading into last season was Antonio Williams, but he played in just 5 games due to a lingering ankle and toe injury, I believe, and only had 224 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. But both of those touchdowns came in week 2 against Clemson's FCS opponent, so he had basically no scoring impact in any of their major games. Their second best projected wide receiver heading into 2023 was Cole Turner, who was also injured and played in just 2 games and had 3 receptions for 28 yards before suffering 3 torn abductor muscles. In 2022, Turner had Clemson's only 100-yard receiving game of the season when he had 3 receptions for 101 yards in the Tigers' ACC Championship victory over North Carolina. He also had 4 receptions for 51 yards against Tennessee in the 2022 Orange Bowl. So getting him back will be a major piece to have available in that receiving corps. They really played the vast majority of last season without their top 2 wide receiving threats that they really thought were going to be the main guys heading into the season, which speaks to what Cade Klubnik did, still throwing for over 2,800 yards, and shows that with a full group of receivers, he really could have a substantial season this fall. And to that receiver room, they added 5-star TJ Moore and 4-star Bryant Wesco, who was rated as a 5-star for the majority of his recruitment. Moore was the number 4 wide receiver, the number 6 player in Florida, and the number 21 overall recruit. And Wesco was the number 11 wide receiver, the number 8 player in Texas, and number 57 overall recruit in the class of 2024. TJ Moore was named the All-American Bowl MVP after he had 11 receptions for 162 yards and 2 touchdowns in that game against some of the other top high school recruits. And Bryant Wesco had a one-handed catch for a touchdown in the Tigers' spring game. So definitely look out for Moore and Wesco to be instant impact players for Clemson this fall. This is where things could get very, very interesting for Clemson in 2024. On the offensive line, they returned nearly every single lineman that they had last season. They had 1 transfer to Colorado and 1 transfer to Charlotte. But outside of that, they returned all 5 starters and most of their depth. They bring back redshirt junior Tristan Lee, senior Marcus Tate, redshirt junior Ryan Linthicum, graduate Walker Parks, junior Blake Miller, graduate Trent Howard, redshirt junior Dietrich Pennington, redshirt sophomore Colin Sadler, and redshirt freshman Ian Reed. Blake Miller was ranked by PFF, Pro Football Focus, as the second best offensive tackle for the 2025 NFL Draft. But arguably a more important detail about that offensive line is that they hired Matt Luke to be their offensive line coach right after the regular season ended last year. Matt Luke was formerly Ole Miss's head coach from 2017 to 2019, and Georgia's offensive line coach in 2020 and 2021 when the Dogs snapped their 40-year national championship drought. Luke was an offensive lineman himself. He played center at Ole Miss from 1995 to 1998, and having him coaching that line, getting a veteran group to work with, and really having his work kind of cut out for him based on last season will certainly be something to keep an eye on for the Tigers. At kicker, they lost Jonathan White, who joined the team in week 4, but really became the guy down the stretch. So they lose him, but they brought in Nolan Hauser, who is the number 1 kicker in the class of 2024, according to 24/7 Sports. So to recap, Clemson really had 3 major areas of weakness last season, all on offense. That was kind of where their weakness was, but those were wide receiver, offensive line, and kicking. Their top wide receiver had 531 yards. They weren't really anywhere close to having a 1,000-yard receiver or a threat on the outside to make defenses worried and not play tight to stop the run. In just 3 of their 13 games did they have a receiver go over 100 yards, and they get back Antonio Williams and Cole Turner and add 2 extremely talented freshmen in 5-star TJ Moore and 4-star Bryant Wesco. Their offensive line was noticeably lacking at certain points last year, especially early in the season when they became the first team in the FBS to reach double-digit fumbles. Those fumbles were extremely critical to, like at the goal line against Miami and Duke, and the 60-yard scoop and score for Florida State. So they fired their offensive line coach and hired a guy who won a national championship coaching offensive linemen just 3 years ago. Their main kicker last season wasn't on the roster until week 4, like I said, and didn't really find a rhythm until about midway through the season. So White's is now gone, and the Tigers went out and got the best kicker recruit in the country. Moving on to the other side of the ball, on defense, Clemson lost linebacker Jeremiah Trotter to the NFL Draft, but will fill that gap with junior Wade Woodaz and 5-star freshman Sammy Brown. Brown was the number 2 linebacker, number 2 player in Georgia, and number 14 overall recruit in the class of 2024. And Wade Woodaz had 28 total tackles, 6 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, a fumble recovery, 2 interceptions, and 1 pick 6 last year for the Tigers. They return a star in senior Barrett Carter, who will be one of the top linebackers in all of college football in 2024. He has accounted for 135 tackles, 20 tackles for loss, 9 sacks, 3 interceptions, 13 pass deflections, 2 forced fumbles, and 2 fumble recoveries over the past 2 seasons. He was recently rated by EA Sports as the best linebacker in their new game. That linebacker room also contains Kobe McLeod, Jamal Anderson, and D. Creighton, and PFF ranks it as the number 1 linebacker unit in college football. On the defensive line, they lost Tyler Davis, Xavier Thomas, and Rook Ororo to the NFL Draft, but returned Peter Woods and TJ Parker, 2 of the best sophomore defensive linemen in the country. Woods was given the highest grade of any Power 5 freshman defensive tackle by PFF last year. They also have him as the second highest graded returning defensive tackle in the ACC. They also bring back DeMonte Capehart, who is 6'5", 320. He was just a nightmare for offensive lines in the middle last season, and he'll be a 5th-year senior this fall. They get back Vic Burley, who missed all of last season after suffering a knee injury in fall camp. Burley is 6'4", 315. He was a 5-star and the number 3 defensive lineman, number 2 player in Georgia, and number 32 overall recruit in the class of 2023. So that's basically like adding another 5-star to their 2024 class. They're also bringing in 4-star edge Darian Mayo, who is 6'7", 250, and he was the number 25 edge, the number 5 player in the state of Maryland, and the number 148 overall recruit in the class of 2024. In the secondary, Nate Wiggins went to the NFL, and Andrew Makuba transferred to Texas, but they return a lot of very talented young guys, most notably sophomore Khalil Barnes, who against South Carolina last year had a fumble recovery, a touchdown, and an interception, all within the Gamecocks' first 3 offensive plays. Against Georgia Tech last year, the Tigers picked off quarterback Haynes King 4 times. All 4 interceptions were made by a different player, and all 4 of those players were freshmen. Those guys were Khalil Barnes, Shelton Lewis, Kylan Griffin, and Avion Terrell. Terrell is another key name to watch for in the secondary. According to PFF, Pro Football Focus, he is the 7th highest graded returning cornerback in the ACC. He's also the younger brother of former Clemson player A.J. Terrell, who had that pick six against Alabama at the start of the 2018 national championship game. And adding to that secondary, the Tigers are bringing in four-star safety Ricardo Jones, four-star corner Corian Gibson, four-star safety Tavoy Fagan, and four-star safety Noah Dixon. And not to bury the lead here, so to speak, but Clemson was one of the youngest teams in the country last year. In 2023, again, according to PFF, Clemson played the most freshmen of any team in college football. They had freshmen take a combined total of 3,991 snaps last season, which is over 800 more than the next team on the list. And that's another thing to keep in mind when looking back at last season is just how much they used and relied on freshmen, and they still won 9 games and were a couple plays from having 10 or 11 wins. So a lot of people, and most people, disagree with Clemson and Dabo Swinney's portal strategy, but their focus on recruits and developing freshmen instead of immediately replacing those guys with a transfer each offseason has them in position to really thrive this year. And with the youngest team in the country last year, they had their top 2 wide receivers go down. Their main kicker was retired and on the couch until week 4. And every time they lost, it was in part due to something that either hadn't happened in their school's history or hadn't happened in at least 35 years. And with all of that, they were bordering on a 10-win season. So now in 2024, all of those freshmen who took nearly 4,000 combined snaps last year have significant, meaningful, real game experience. And then you pair that with QB1 coming back in Klubnik, running back 1 coming back in Maffa, wide receiver 1 coming back in Tyler Brown, and wide receiver 1 from 2022 in Antonio Williams coming back after his injury. Tight end 1 coming back in Brenningstool, the entire starting offensive line coming back, the addition of a national championship winning offensive line coach, the best linebacker and the best linebacker unit in the country, remarkable talent and depth in the secondary, and a picture starts to get painted of just how much potential Clemson has this year. Going back to the schedule for this fall, I think Clemson has a real opportunity to have a season similar to those that they saw between like 2015 and 2020. And I believe this team has the capability to be right in the middle of not only the ACC Championship picture, but the college football playoff and national championship conversations. They're currently a 13-point underdog to Georgia in week 1, but I think that game may be a lot closer than a lot of people probably think. And then after that game, they get App State at home, NC State at home. Traveling to FSU will be a tough environment, but Wake Forest, Virginia, they get Louisville at home. Maybe they could get tripped up on the road at Virginia Tech in Lane Stadium. Always a tough place to play, but the Tigers are 3-0 in Blacksburg under Dabo Swinney with wins by 20, 14, and 35. Then at Pitt, the Citadel, South Carolina at home. I mean, I think there is a world where Clemson could be 11-1 or potentially better than that if they win in Atlanta on August 31st. There is also a world where things go like they did last season for the Tigers and they drop games to Georgia and Florida State and Virginia Tech or maybe at Pitt, but I think that would be a worst case scenario, injury-riddled season type of situation and lean more toward the likelihood of Clemson having a 10 or 11 win regular season. That's going to wrap up this episode. Really appreciate you tuning in, especially if you made it all the way to this point. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed and subscribe to the channel on YouTube or follow the podcast on Spotify if you're listening there. And make sure to go follow CFB Kings on Twitter and Instagram as well for all things college football. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day and take care.